So I'm Dr. David Marquis, and I've been in the county for about 20 years now, and I've been practicing in functional medicine for the majority of that time. And in the 20 years that I've practiced, I've not come across a book that has impacted my life and the thought pattern that I have about sharing some health information with people more than this book up here, Brainmaker, which I've been so impressed with that I've taken the time to write on it and give a couple of lectures and strongly suggest to my patients that they take the time to read it and understand it. Because I think that it's quite possible to read through that and think that it may not apply if you just give it a cursory review. But this information literally applies to every single human being on the planet, and particularly to North Americans for some reasons that I hope to make clear this evening. Much of the information that we come across in life sometimes seems to be a regurgitation of things that we'd heard previously and perhaps didn't understand or weren't prepared to receive at the time. And then as we go through life, certain circumstances bring us to the point where it has more meaning. Certainly tonight's information is something that we've heard about from the beginning of medicine, because this is something that Hippocrates, the father of medicine, taught us about over 2,000 years ago. He talked about a portion of our being, and he referred to it as the innate at that time, as something that we can tap into to use as a reservoir for healing. Now that reservoir that we're going to talk about tonight is collectively called the microbiome. The microbiome is the collection of all 100 trillion live organisms that reside within our intestinal tract, predominantly the large intestines, and that's a key point that'll come up a little bit later. 100 trillion is something that I don't think anyone can really conceive of. It's a number so large. So to try and put a human framework around it, take a $1 bill and 1 trillion $1 bills stacked end to end will go to the sun and back one time. You do that 100 times and you've got 100 trillion. That's kind of the framework that you can conceive of it in. That's the number of colonies that we have residing within inside of us, and yet our total cellular makeup is 10 times less. We have about 10 trillion cells in our entire body. So there's literally more of them than there are us. We are their house. Now another example that I'd like to have you think about is what these little critters are doing inside of us. So all 100 trillion of these bacteria, yeast, they all have jobs, and they're really important jobs. So if you imagine your gastrointestinal tract, the large intestine, like a factory, take a look inside that factory and imagine you've got some groupings that are working on making neurotransmitters. So our neurotransmitters are really what make us human. It's what allows us to think, to feel, to experience life in a meaningful way, literally to move. It's what allows us to not be depressed, to not have anxiety. In the absence of neurotransmitters, we don't function. So you've got this whole group or company of bacteria that are in charge of that aspect of us. Then you've got a whole nother group that are in charge of managing the processing of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, that's where we get our fuel from. And depending on the type and quantity of bacteria that you have in your GI tract, some are going to convert those into fats more efficiently than others, to energy that can be used right now or stored for a later period of time. Then you've got a whole nother group or company within this massive factory that is in charge of managing your inflammation, how inflamed you get. Then you've got another group that is in charge of detoxification. As a matter of fact, this particular group handles about 1/3 of the detoxification capacity of what your liver can do. Now imagine walking into that same factory and somebody has taken away 50% of the employees. And they didn't selectively, they didn't say, I'm just going to chop the employees right in half. They selectively picked off The more educated employees, the ones that are making the neurotransmitters, the ones that are managing your inflammation, the ones that are allowing for detoxification. And the ones that are left are the ones that haven't got that education or the capacity to do the things that you want them to do. This is the state of most North Americans. We start out life at about 50% of the microbiome that we should have. Not only do we start with fewer beneficial bacteria, we start to decimate the ones that we have remaining through the process of stress. Stress causes more inflammation in the gastrointestinal lining. Now this is a depiction of a grouping of cells, and it's talking about the gastrointestinal cells. It's only one cell layer thick. So there's not a lot between them and us to act as a barrier. And when this starts to become negatively impacted by stressors or inflammation, it actually becomes more permeable in real time, such that things that didn't bother us previously start to become a bother now. So the more you impact that, the greater your capacity is to become irritated by life, whether that be food or environmental toxins. So sometimes people will say, geez, that never really bothered me before. I don't understand what's different now. Well, what's different is that there's been adequate stress load, and you can fill in what that stressor might be. It can be a trauma, it can be an infection, it can be an emotional stressor, it can be a chemical exposure. It can be a life event. For the purposes of this conversation, pregnancy is actually an event that shifts many women into an autoimmune process, kind of what I'm leading to here and talking about. Once that changes, once that gastrointestinal membrane changes, it leads us to a point where we start to mismanage many of the nutrients that work crew is supposed to be handling. One of the things that I left out that they're supposed to do is they're supposed to manage the absorption and conversion of many of our key nutrients. So your fat-soluble nutrients, A, E, D, K. Your B-complex, many of those B-complex nutrients, particularly B12, folate, they're supposed to be converted in the body once they get there. Now some people have genetic predisposition to not managing it well, and that would be a double fault for them. But assuming that their genes are working okay, they need an intact microbiome to allow for those nutrients to be converted so that they can repair themselves. So what this slide here shows is that there's a high prevalence in particularly children with Asperger's syndrome, and that's identified early on because of what's happened with their gut lining from birth. So something happened in that birthing process that has inhibited their gastrointestinal lining from managing key coenzymes like zinc carnosine, which is essential for maintaining the integrity of the gut and acts as a cofactor in over 300 different enzymatic processes that allow us to think, feel, and be us. Once that process goes wrong and you're not handling some of your trace nutrients, it starts to affect how the GI tract works. Now, not everybody gets this. Matter of fact, that's a crucial point that I'd like to point out. Only 25% of the population actually feel these gut issues in their gut. The other 75%, it's manifest in other ways. So it might be brain fog. It might be joint pain. It might be chronic fatigue. You just can't get your energy back. It might be muscle tone where you're chronically tight because you're inflamed all the time. It can be, whenever you see, not whenever, but most of the time when you see bilateral arthritides, so somebody, both of their knees are going out or both of their hips are going out, if it's bilateral, you can bet there's an autoimmune process behind that, unless they had the miracle of having both of those knocked out at the same time from some trauma. Unilateral things, it can be a mixed bag, but almost all the time when I see people with bilateral things, I know that, okay, there's something going wrong right here in the gut, and we can go backwards and turn off much of the pain that way. Other things that might manifest more externally: eczema, psoriasis, lupus, scleroderma. Autoimmune disorders like Hashimoto's thyroiditis or Graves. All of these things are what manifest when that gut lining has gone awry. This is a summary slide in regards to that process, and I'm not going to belabor this point, but I just want to name some of the diseases to see how familiar you are with what happens when that gut lining starts to go awry. So I'm going to name some of these, like MS, Guillain-Barré, rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, polymyalgia rheumatica, fibromyalgia, eczema, psoriasis, scleroderma, asthma, peripheral neuropathies, celiac, Crohn's, colitis, lupus, Hashimoto's. Is there anyone in here that doesn't know somebody that's dealing with one of those? That's something that hits home. Everyone knows someone who's being affected by this if you're not being affected by yourself. Now this process is what we're talking about. That's why I said that that book has been so impactful to me, because it's brought home why some patients seem to fall through the cracks despite their best efforts. They might change their diet. They might be taking the things that you would think would normally support the human body in terms of energetics and repair, and yet they still don't get there. But when we start to understand how important this grouping is in the gut that controls our immune system, we can start to understand why that happens to people, and more importantly, how to work your way back. This is a slide that shows us partially how that happens. I want to give you the example of birth. When you get pregnant, your body has to shift its TH balance. And let me orient you to this first. What we're looking at here is a family photo. Not my family, all of our family. And we call this one the white blood cell family photo. The parentage starts up here with grandma and grandpa white blood cell. Everybody down here, they have different names, but ultimately they came from that family. So you've got your T helper cells. You've got a stimulator, a suppressor, and a regulator. I would call these the grandparentage up here, even though they're T helpers. They're going to be the closest to what we're talking about, the mothership, so to speak. Below that, you're going to have the cytokines and the interleukins. These are going to be kind of like the young rascals that are running around the family reunion. They're really important members because they're the young ones, but they can sure make a mess. The next group down there, that's going to be your immunoglobulins. We'll call those the aunts, the uncles, the older teenagers that are just about out of high school. They've got some of their education under them, and they've got some life goals, some stick-to-itiveness. Grouped together, there's this interplay or communication. So the communication works like this. You get pregnant, and your body normally will shift into a Th1 dominance. That means that your immune system goes into an overdrive, and it says, something's not right here. And so you're nauseous, you're vomiting, you're not feeling that great for the first trimester. T regulator says, no, this is a normal response. Let's calm down, let's walk through this because we want to allow this pregnancy to come to term. And so you become Th2 dominant for the next 2 trimesters. And by and large, most women feel pretty good through that process. They might get a head cold, but they're generally not going to have overt symptoms like they did in that first trimester, unless they went into pregnancy already carrying an autoimmune condition, in which case they might have what's called hyperemesis gravidarum, where they're vomiting and nauseous for all 9 months. So that's somebody who went into it already Th1 dominant, so when their immune system tipped further that direction, they became symptomatically worse. Many women will comment that after pregnancy, and down the line, they'll say, you know, my health has never been quite the same since the birth of, and then you fill in the blank of that child. Those are the women that never quite came out of Th2 dominance. These are the folks that might end up becoming chemically sensitive or fibro or end up with Hashimoto's down the line. And it was that immune shift that they never quite got back out of. Well, this next row down here, the cytokines, interleukins, and immunoglobulins, those are the ones that your immune system is going to be allowing to have an interface with your environment, primarily at the gut. That's the first place where it happens. And so if that immune system, because of stress, has gotten beat up, and remember we started out with 50% of what we should have had gastrointestinally, so it doesn't even have the capacity to carry out much of what we want it to do. goes through a stressful period of time, now your immune system has no choice but to try and protect you. But it's protecting you from stuff that really it shouldn't be protecting you from. When we get into that situation where the immune system's gone awry, our body's looking for some things to help to modulate it. Now, depending on where you live, you might have an adequate supply of some of these, particularly vitamin D. And you would think where we live, here on the Central Coast, that you'd have adequate supply. But the interesting thing about it is that vitamin D is latitude dependent. So depending on where you live, you may or may not have adequate vitamin D levels, despite sun exposure. So here in the Central Coast, our latitude provides UVB rays between May and August, primarily between 10 and 2. Before May and after August, you could be buck naked outside and not get UVB rays, so you won't convert vitamin D. Now, the importance of vitamin D is that along with glutathione and nitric oxide, those are your 3 best immune modulating compounds. And so when your immune status is high in terms of overreactivity, you want more support from those families to help to regulate it so that it can discern good from bad, self from non-self. It helps that Th3, the regulator, to calm down and direct the stimulator to the suppressor. Now, glutathione is a close buddy in that sense, and glutathione is something that your body's supposed to be making on a continual basis to handle inflammation. It's supposed to be regulating some of this process here of that conversion from one side to the other on the scale of what your immune system's doing. Glutathione is not readily available in an individual who is burdening their system with stress and toxins. So it's something that you either have to make, and we'll talk about how you can make that later, or take. Now, until about 2 years ago, you really couldn't take glutathione orally because it wasn't stable, but they've now stabilized that, so it's something that people can actually acquire in an oral fashion rather than just depending on IVs, which is what we had to do previously. Nitric oxide, that's definitely something we have access to and we can push regularly in a dietary fashion to help to support the immune system. I'll talk to you about that in just a moment. So these autoimmune diseases, they are pandemic. It's affecting worldwide because of this process that we talked about in just a moment ago about the gastrointestinal tract not starting out on the right foot, and then it goes downhill from there. But we really aren't paying attention to it beyond the process of saying, how can I suppress it? So most approaches towards taking care of an autoimmune process have to do with steroids or some of the biologics, which God bless us for having them, because if someone's in an acute flare, you want to at least have some quality of life, but to depend on that without understanding the underlying process really cuts our quality of life short, because we're not getting to the root cause of what's going on there. Research on this is just exploding right now. About a decade ago, the vitamin D was kind of the pet research project and was coming out with research on almost a daily basis with new publications. Today, you see the same thing in the gastrointestinal world. And it's supporting this information, which is really why BrainMaker came out. That process of information coming out like this, it takes about 10 years before it's going to hit doctors' offices for people to actually implement it, which is one of the reasons why I'm trying to share this right now, because you won't hear this for a long time unless you're doing your own digging. Just a few articles here. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but like this one, this is published just 2 months ago. It says Vitamin D, Immune Regulation, the Microbiota, and Inflammatory Bowel Disease. Next one is the impact of human milk bacteria, oligosaccharides on the neonatal gut microbiota establishment and gut health. What those both say is that from the beginning, if we're not getting it from mom, we're not getting it at all. And number 2, if you don't have adequate levels of some of these immune modulating things, it's difficult to maintain what you do have. I'm going to restate that in another way. Children, when they're born, are at a deficit for having appropriate gut health for 3 reasons. C-sections, antibiotic exposure in the first year of life, and not nursing for more than a couple of months. Those are the 3 legs to the stool that are supposed to be keeping our children's gut intact from the beginning. Adults or growing children get hit in 5 other ways. First way, antibiotic exposure for the rest of us. Number 2, artificial sweeteners. Number 3, Roundup Ready grains. Number 4, stress, chronic stress. And number 5 is chronic latent infections. So I'm going to break those down for you here. The culture that we compare ourselves to in terms of gut health is a tribe down in South America that hasn't been westernized yet, the Yanomami Indians. If you do any type of study on cultural experiences, you'll see their name popping up when you're looking at indigenous tribes, because they're kind of the standard that we say, okay, this is what a human being could be, because they haven't been polluted yet. When they make those statements that we have 50% less microbiota than we should, that's who we're compared to. And remember, I said it's not just taking that whole bowl of bacteria and chopping it in half. It's selectively pulling out the really good ones that you want. So by not having that, we've now shown that autoimmune disease just skyrockets. And then the next thing we've learned is that through the American process, and I listed 5 things just now, we decimate more of what we do have. And that process spreads because of something called cross-reactivity. So in the GI tract, where we have that immune system, I showed you the family tree, some of those cytokines and some of those immunoglobulins start to go after particular things that are leaking through the GI tract. And when I say things, I'm referring to usually food. As food, partially undigested, gets into the bloodstream, the immune system has no choice but to try and capture it, because it can't be there. It can't just float around willy-nilly. It's going to cause problems. So the immune system says, let's take this thing out. And they start to code for it. Well, it turns out that some foods look like other foods. If you look at the American diet, it's really difficult to find a meal that doesn't have those common foods that so many people say, well, that's just a fad. But gluten, dairy, soy, eggs, and lectins comprise most of what we eat at all 3 meals a day. And because of the frequent exposure, and because of the frequent stress levels that we have, and our GI lining becoming irritated, and us not having an appropriate military to defend against the exposure, this process starts to ensue. You'll have an antibody that goes after, let's say, a wheat particle. That same antibody now, because of similar looks, will go after casein, which comes from dairy, or soy, in some folks eggs, in many other folks lectins. And this is how we start to have problems with our environment. And it just spreads out if it's left unchecked. So much so that recently Cornell and King's College of England did an interesting study. They took some college students and they said, let's look at your gut bacteria and see what you got, and then we're going to see what effect eating the standard American fare will do to you. And so they took these students and they measured their gut bacteria out and they got their baseline. And then they said, okay, go out and eat fast food 3 times a day for the next 10 days and then come back here and we're going to measure it again. And they found that through the course of 10 days, they were able to collectively decimate 40% of their microbiome. Or what that translated to was another 1,400 colonies. And the interesting thing about it is, again, it wasn't just chopping it down the middle, or at 40-60, it was selectively pulling out 40% of the good guys. So then they started to test and they said, okay, well, with the ones that we have left, what do they do? And they found that some of these bacteria, and they started to name them, and they said, okay, let's look at what's the difference between these good and the bad. And collectively, they called the bad the Firmicutes, and they called the good the Bacteroidetes. We'll just call them the F and the B's. They found that the F group causes inflammation, and in terms of obesity, it has the unique capacity of converting carbohydrates to fat, body fat, 10 times faster than the bacterioids. So you can have two people sitting side by side, both eating their Big Mac, and one person's going to balloon out and the other person's not, if they have these two different types of bacteria, until the one that has the good bacteria catches up in terms of what their gut flora looks like.
Is it the lack of the F group or
the abundance?
Abundance.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
This is a study that brought this to light, and it was a mouse study. And I have a picture of the two mice that were involved in this study towards the end of the talk. But shows two twins, little tiny guys. And what they did is they took gut bacteria from an obese human and they put it into the GI tract of this one mouse. And then they let them do their bit for about 3 weeks. And so they were eating and playing, doing their standard daily activity. Didn't change anything other than who lived inside that one mouse's gut. Within 3 weeks, the mouse that acquired the human gut bacteria was 2.5 times larger than it started. It just ballooned out. Then they did the reverse of it. Apparently mice eat other mice feces. And they took that fat mouse and they put it into a group of mice that were all skinny. And they found that within about a month, that mouse skinnied right back up because it converted. And then they did it back again. And they found that it's like a light switch. They can make them balloon out or skinny up depending on who is living in their gut. So here's the summary on those 5 things. To reiterate it again, we as adults start to damage our gastrointestinal lining and who lives there through antibiotic exposure. And I should clarify that because many people say, well, I haven't really been on antibiotics. Everyone in this room is on antibiotics on a daily basis if you're eating anything that you buy at a restaurant or at the grocery store, unless you're actually raising your own chickens, beef, and pigs, you're getting antibiotics. And so slowly but surely we knock ourselves out on the inside. So antibiotics, artificial sweeteners. This was a really funny one to me because so many people who are working on their weight say, I'm drinking my Diet Cherry Coke, but that shouldn't make me fat. And yet it does exactly that. These artificial sweeteners selectively knock out the good ones and they support the bad bacteria. Subsequent to the drinking of that, anything else that you eat now is going to balloon you out 10 times faster. Stress and chronic infection. Just talked about the sweeteners. Oh, one other fact about those artificial sweeteners, and this is another one that really needs to be publicized. The use of artificial sweeteners, because of what it does to your immune system, remember I said that really is the house of our immune system? Because they're knocking out the guys that are supposed to be protecting us, it increases the incidence of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, twofold. So you're twice as likely to get diabetes from drinking diet drinks than you are by drinking straight sugar. This is the Roundup Ready grain issue. Here in the United States, and it's spreading across the planet, grains have become more and more of an issue. And people ask the question, well, why is that so? What's the problem with the grains? It wasn't a problem when I was a kid. And it really wasn't. I was totally unaware of this problem as a kid. And the first thing that came to my mind was some of the studies on deamidation. So they've changed the protein structure of the wheat. And I thought, well, that has to be it. It's a different protein. The human body doesn't recognize this as something that should be ingested. And I think there is a role for that. I think that's still a big player, that we've changed what that protein looks like. But I think this may be a bigger player because when I'm doing food antibody testing and environmental testing with people, I'm seeing almost every patient that comes through reactive to glyphosate. That's Roundup. And you think, well, I don't spray Roundup at my house. Why is that a problem? Well, you're eating it. Every time you eat any grain or anything made from grain, you're eating glyphosate. because 99% of the grains that reach the market here in the United States are made Roundup ready, meaning that they spray just before harvest to get all the weeds down so the combines don't get stuck as they go through, and they have a faster, cleaner harvest. That glyphosate does to our GI tract and the critters who live there the same thing that the antibiotics do. It decimates the good, preserving the bad. So much so, I'm going to turn that light back on here. We've got this graph here. This starts at 1990 and it goes up to 2010. And it shows a hand-in-glove approach. This black line is glyphosate on this is wheat in particular, spraying on wheat. And this yellow line is the incidence of celiac. Look at what's happening to our GI tract because of exposure to these things.
Are you saying it's in bread?
Oh yeah.
I thought it was just in meat, but it's in bread.
Yeah, anything that they can spray it on, it's there. And that's, I'll go back to that one. This is grain in particular. And you can bet if you're buying corn, soy, wheat, rice, they're spraying it so that they can get rid of the weeds before they harvest. This was a recent study done to see, okay, chronic exposure to antibiotics. What does that do to the gut microbiota? And does the microbiota have a chance to recover? So in this study, they were looking at people, like some folks, I was one of them. I had a history of 25 years of chronic sinusitis and migraines because of what I was eating. Didn't understand that until I went through this whole process myself, that I was poisoning myself on a daily basis. Well, at that time, at the worst time of my life, I was using antibiotics probably every 3 to 4 months, trying to keep my sinuses clear. And I have a lot of patients in that same boat. So when they sit down, I'm like, I've been there, I know that one. Chronic antibiotic exposure decimates those good guys, and they've confirmed that now with research showing that yes, some bacteria does come back, and they say, well, collectively you still have roughly the same quantity, but the biodiversity is what's not there. You never recoup what you had unless you're actively trying to replace it. This is another summary slide here. This one summarizes the difference between the Firmicutes and the bacterioids. And what it shows here is just body regions and the effect. So if you have a higher quantity of those Firmicutes, you're going to experience things like anxiety, depression, brain fog. You're going to have a more difficult time maintaining weight both externally and internally. And when I say weight internally, I'm talking about how it affects those of us who genetically aren't predisposed to putting it on the outside. Many people are predisposed to laying down that within inside their arteries. And so this is where this feeds right into heart disease. That's something that hits my family at home because that's where our genetic predisposition is for cerebrovascular disease. And when you have a higher quantity of those, that's going to be laid down internally if you're allowing that process to occur. The detoxification process is compromised, so you end up having more skin issues. You might have eczema and psoriasis, strange itchy patches that you can't explain. Why am I itching? And it has to do with how the body's not metabolizing some of those key nutrients. For example, many folks who have the strange itching phenomena starts in the gut, usually, but then it's displacement or malabsorption of your essential fats, a particular type of calcium, calcium lactate, which is found in tissue, and vitamin D. So anybody who's had a sunburn before, they've experienced what's called hypervitaminosis D. You've had too much D on that day. And what's happened is the calcium lactate has been leached out of the tissue, so it's no longer pliable. And so you end up getting blisters and peels. Well, one of the things that you can do if you're in that situation, along with trying to optimize your gut bacteria, is make sure that those 3 key nutrients are functioning appropriately. So if you're getting a lot of D, you better make sure that you're getting a whole boatload of vitamin F, which is your polyunsaturates, so it'd be something like flax oil, along with some calcium lactate. Muscles tend to be achier in these folks because of the amount of inflammation that comes out, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And many times, about 25% of the population will have GI issues. How does this play into brain health? Well, the first thing that I commented on is that these little critters have specific jobs. Some of them are responsible for neurotransmitters. This is a study that was done on looking at intestinal bacteria and which neurotransmitters they produce. So they started to isolate different bacteria. And they found that one particular family, Bifidobacterium dentinium, is responsible for making about 70% of your GABA. What's GABA do? GABA makes you happy. GABA makes you not anxious. It makes your mind rest so that you can get to sleep. It makes you be able to stay focused. For motor control, it's really important for things like tics and other things that people might consider a nervous disorder. In the absence of those bacteria, you're going to be at a loss. Now, you're still going to be making some in the brain, but you're going to lose about 70% of what you could be having because you don't have it where it's made. We need to listen to our guts. And you can't listen to them if you don't know who's living there. It'd be like never meeting your neighbor next door. This problem is not just affecting adults. As I said, it starts in youth for those 3 reasons: C-sections, antibiotics in the first year of life, and lack of breastfeeding. And then the 5 adult principles begin to apply as we start to introduce life to our kids. Once the shift has occurred and you've got more of the Firmicutes, the unfriendly guys, than the good guys, what happens is that your body starts to get inflamed. And people say, well, why do I get inflamed from this? It has to do with the outside lining of these bacteria. How many of you have ever pulled chicken out of your fridge and it's been there a couple days too long and it's really slimy? You know that slimy feel on meat? And you go, I don't think I want to cook this. Well, maybe if I wash it, it'll be okay. And then you go, no, I'm just not going to do it. Better not. That slimy feel, those are lipopolysaccharides. So that's the outside of this unfriendly bacteria. Now we have that inside us when we have a preponderance of Firmicutes. And when that gets into the bloodstream, it grosses out the inside of our body just like it would gross you out on your kitchen counter. So you're looking at that stuff and you say, yeah, I don't want to eat that. Well, that's what your immune system says too. And as soon as it's introduced to it, it says, we got to get this thing out of here. It'd be like inviting a full-size lipopolysaccharide-laden bacteria into your car. Okay, can I lay down a blanket or something that I'll throw away after you leave? Because you don't want that on you. You don't want that on your material. We don't want that in our body because what it does is it's like a napalm attack on your tissue. Major depressive disorders show 60 times the amount of lipopolysaccharides in the body than standard controls. This is true of most neuropsychiatric disorders and most inflammatory conditions. You're going to find those LPS antibodies at high levels. What does that do in the body? Well, one of the things that it does is it fries neural tissue. What I have here is an image of a normal 43-year-old male, and right next to it I have an alcoholic 43-year-old, and you can see the difference in the size and structure of the brain. Now this isn't lipopolysaccharide specific right here, but the same process occurs. This is actually insulin and sugar. That's what happens when you end up with alcoholic brain, and also type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's. So when you're not managing insulin and blood sugar, your noggin starts to fry. And when that happens, your capacity to enjoy life and function plummets really quickly. I put this slide in here to give you another example of this concept of frying neural tissue, because it occurs through a process that we commonly call caramelization. When you're cooking onions, which, most people really like the smell of cooking onions, and so this process draws a lot of folks into restaurants. They get soft and they get brown. That caramelizing effect is the denaturing or the changing of the protein structure of that onion. And it occurs because of heat. That heat is what I want to share with you that occurs when we throw our blood sugar and insulin off or allow high lipopolysaccharide count in our body. So there's certain numbers that we should know about ourselves. And at the bottom of that handout that I gave you, I listed off about 5 tests that I would strongly encourage people to consider having so that they have an awareness of where they're at. One of them happens to be your hemoglobin A1C, because that gives you your 3-month average of what your blood sugar looks like. Here's another summary slide. This just lists off the common disorders observed in individuals who have high Firmicutes count. Depression, moody, anxiety, panic attacks, insomnia, sleep disorders, PMS, fibro, obesity, and interestingly, the flip side of that. Remember I said it can balloon you out on the outside or on the inside? Anorexia and bulimia, that's more because of what it does to those neurotransmitters. It changes the neurochemistry so the individual has a difficult time being content and happy with themselves. They don't have adequate serotonin and GABA. Hypoglycemia, chronic pain, migraines, cognitive disorders like ADD and ADHD, and restless leg. All because of those lipopolysaccharides. I share this slide because it ties together this process of neural degeneration, but it also gives people hope. And I share this one in most of my talks because I don't want to come across as doom and gloom. I want to give people an avenue, A, of understanding how we got to where we are in terms of inflammation, but that if you catch it in time, you can turn things around with a concerted effort. This is a slide that shows 3 MRIs of a same individual. When this individual presented to his neurologist, he had some symptoms of numbness in his hands and some poor memory. Doc said, well, I see that you have some cortical defects here, meaning that there's some changes in the gray matter of his head, the white matter of his head. It's not consistent any longer. Many people would call that plaquing. 3 months later, he came back in, but he was being pushed in a wheelchair. It had progressed really rapidly. He had lost the function of his limbs. And when they did another MRI, they said, my goodness, this thing is really progressing fast. And that's when they did some more advanced testing to look at some of the things that we were just talking about, things that can create inflammation in their environment, both dietarily and environmentally. Pulled those out, and 6 months later, this guy walks back in. He's out of the wheelchair now. He's able to talk. Memory's doing pretty well. And you can see how they're actually all smaller than even the first one. Our brains have a great deal of plasticity. That means that not only can we change function, but we can literally change structure through stopping the inflammatory process. But that takes consistent effort and moving the right direction. Amongst those tests that I mentioned there, one of them is knowing your genetics. I strongly encourage people to do this because the cost point on genetic testing is unbelievably low today. I don't anticipate it to get any higher because it's really come down a great deal in the past 5 years. But the volume of tests that you can get for $99 now is just crazy. About 2 to 3 years ago, those were the only tests that I was doing with folks because those 3 tests alone would break the bank on somebody. But they were really useful tests and would help me guide people. But now I can get about 200 other genetic components that kind of work synergistically with that little bit of information to help me to understand how to support people nutritionally and what some of their antecedents, the things that predispose them to be dealing with the issues that they're dealing with when they sit in front of me, what those were and how we can guide them later on. So this company here, 23andMe, it's direct access. You all have the capacity to go online, pay that company $99. They're going to send you a little kit. You spit in it and you send it back to them. They're going to send you a genealogy profile. You go, what the heck is this? You take that genealogy profile and you upload it into a different site. And there's multiples of them. We like to use LiveWello, and it gives you your full genome. And then from that, you can either try and decipher it yourself, or you can find some guy like me that'll help walk you through that. Very useful information. Another one that I wrote down there was looking at your organic acid profile and your digestive stool profile. Those two things will help you understand who's living inside you and how they're affecting you. That comes through Genova Labs. And then the last one is looking at food antibodies. I encourage people to find out what it is in their environment dietarily that works for them right now. It's not the alpha and omega of what you can always eat, but it gives you a really good starting point so that you can turn your inflammation off now, apply these other steps, and start to work forward so that once the inflammatory load comes down, you can start to reintroduce some of these foods that are less reactive to you. Once you've done that, I encourage people to look at doing neurofeedback, because many of us get into a situation where we've been repeatedly bombarded neurologically, and so we actually get into patterns. These patterns get rooted in our neurology so that we have poor plasticity. We do the wrong thing over and over again, and we get good at doing the wrong thing. And so sometimes once you've benefited your gastrointestinal tract and you've got the gut bacteria, so they're making those neurotransmitters, and you have ample supply of the fuel, so to speak, you need to change the hard wiring and say, okay, here's what we really want you to do. Well, neurofeedback is a really neat tool because it promotes positive plasticity. This right here is a picture of Corey Liggett. He's a defensive end for San Diego Chargers. And this type of a tool is used in many different sports applications, but it was actually designed by the military originally for PTSD, to help people overcome traumatic episodes that really changed their neurology and changed their life course. And you can retrain a brain just like you can learn a new skill. Let's say you want to sit down and learn the piano. Well, it's going to take a lot of practice. And by going over that process day after day, week after week, pretty soon you can become a pianist. Whoever we are, we can develop new skills. And it's through this behavioral training that we promote positive plasticity. Well, neurofeedback just allows us to do it in a very focused fashion. So you start by putting on one of these caps right here, and it allows you to take a look, much like looking at blood labs and stool labs, allows us to look at our chemistry. This allows us to look at our neurology. So you can see if somebody has sleep issues or anxiety issues or depressive tendencies, because your brain waves will show that type of a response. And whatever you have, then you say, okay, I would like to correct this region of what's not working well for me. And neurofeedback allows you to go through operant conditioning, where you can start to retrain the brain to present with the desirable behavior. The initial map is one that you can compare to after you've done it repeatedly, so that you can see how you're changing. And just like piano or basketball or any other skill that you're trying to do, it doesn't necessarily happen overnight, but by continuing through that process for a period of time, there's measurable changes. And then those measurable changes start to relate to how we function. This is just an overview slide that gives you an idea of the things that you can actually see when you're doing an EEG in terms of commonalities. So if the left side of the brain is showing weakness in terms of some of the major wavelengths, delta, theta, alpha, beta, you might be having difficulty with fine motor skill, pronouncing words, reading phonics, delayed speech, auditory processing. This is really an interesting one to me because we've actually had several cases of tinnitus, and actually one case where an individual was born with the inability to hear in one ear, and over the course of about 20 sessions, we're able to change the processing of information in that ear, because he had a hearing aid in that the ear could hear, but he couldn't make sense of what he could hear. It just sounded like static and noise, and so he hated his hearing aid. And he would always pull it out, and he said, you know, it doesn't make sense for me to put it in because it sounds like static. And over the course of about 20 sessions of doing neurofeedback, he had 70% improvement where he could now stick a phone up to that ear and actually hear clearly because it tied together his auditory cortex to what was coming into that tympanic membrane. Started to make reason tying the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and the sensory nerves in the ear all together. Right-sided weakness, this is the one where we see a lot of change in individuals who are manifesting anxiety, ADHD, panic attacks, hyperactivity. Many people who are looking at like ADHD symptoms, that they'll commonly call this left side the gas pedal and this side the brake, and when that brake pedal's not working, that's when you get, you know, that ramping up effect. Research confirms how well this works in changing the structure and function, so much so that a couple years back, Dr. Duffy, the professor of pediatric neurology at Harvard, came out with this statement: in my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. After he made that statement, the American Academy of Pediatrics added neurofeedback as a stage 1 implementation for working with kids with ADHD and ADD, right alongside their meds, and I believe it's starting to supersede that in some areas where it's being embraced more readily. The learning, just like if you learn to play piano, you might get rusty if you haven't sat down and done it for a little while, or you might get rusty at a game of basketball if you haven't been out with it for a little while. You never really forget it. So the learning is actually permanent. You've rewired a pattern there. This is a summary slide that talks to you about the things that I would like to leave people with. And I put this down there at the end of my handout. Along with those tests, you'll gather the information as to what your food intolerances are. We all have them. Just because you don't feel it in the gut doesn't mean that it's not there. Understand your food intolerances, understand your genetic predisposition, and understand who lives within you. Once you've got that in place, you're now empowered to make the changes necessary to start to move forward. The rest of this really is about eating. We need to take time to plan. Take time to plan your meals. You know, take some time Sunday evening or whatever your first day of the week is and say, okay, this week here's what we're going to eat. And then when you go out and get it, try and get the best things that you can, things that haven't been made Roundup ready. Try and get meats that haven't been laden with antibiotics and hormones. And then take the time to actually prepare that so that you can have a rich environment to feed yourself and fuel that body. Once you've done that, your inflammation will be coming down. That's when, if you still have residual issues, that's where you can start working on the space between your ears, training and retraining the brain. We always need to be working on that. Think about that caramelization. All of us get into that state at times. I have some patients that when they first come to me, you know, they put themselves to bed with a glass of wine. That's unopposed carbohydrates. That causes your insulin and glucose to spike. That's going to caramelize your brain that night. Or other folks, they got to have their dessert before they go to bed. Caramelizing your brain at night. Some folks sleep with a little bag of peanut M&Ms by their bed because they wake up hypoglycemic and they pop a few in. Gets me right back to sleep, doc. It works every time. Well, of course it does. You just fried your brain some more. So we're eating ourselves into these little bits of not quite coma.
So you're saying you can't eat caramelized onions? Or is that a metaphor?
No, that was a metaphor.
Okay, I can still eat caramelized onions.
However, ironically, I cannot eat caramelized onions because I have a gene that prevents me from metabolizing sulfur. And so caramelized onions, for me, create joint inflammation. As much as I love them, genetically, I don't handle them well. That might not be true of anyone else in this room.
I hope so.
Doctor?
Yes.
When you said you have a adversity to the caramelized onions,
Yes.
how did you know that? Was it a test?
It was, and I'm really grateful to that test because it didn't come up on the other tests that I did. These tests that I'm talking to you about, I've done these on myself. I'm probably making a lot of noise every time I tap my chest. Huh? No, not you, I'm talking. So first I looked at all my food sensitivities and I pulled those out. That's really what took away my migraines and my chronic sinusitis. It took about a 2-month process, but it cleared out my head amazingly. And it gave me the testimony to stand before you and share this. That was like 18 years ago. Moving forward, onions were still plaguing me and I didn't know it. And when I did this gene panel, it started to show predispositions of things that I probably couldn't handle well. So onions happen to fall into that same grouping of sulfur-bearing foods like garlic, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower. And none of those do well with me, and I just thought it was, oh, I must be allergic to them and they're just not showing up. It was not an immune-mediated response. I just don't break sulfur down well.
Now, is this the same type of sulfur as like MSM or the different kind of
As a matter of fact, it is. You're going to find the different forms of sulfur like in supplements, like SAMe, that's a sulfur group. That tears me up.
Is that right?
For somebody else that can handle that because their CBS gene's intact, it might be just the ticket for their depression or anxiety.
So the normal layperson wouldn't know by getting our genetic test what that gene was. Is that where you come into play?
That's exactly where I come in.
Okay.
That's really where my specialty lies, in starting to discern how to walk people through this.
I love it. I think it's great.
It's pretty amazing.
You know, like you said a while ago, 10 years to get to know some of these things. Now, my daughter Vicki and I have been eating correctly and all this, but we still have concerns about
Sure.
things.
Yeah. There's always fine-tuning to do. And, you know, my practice is not the same today as it was a year ago, and certainly different than it was 10 years ago. I know it'll be different in another 5 years because I'm continually trying to learn and embrace new information, because that's how we grow.
That's exactly right.
Last couple of slides that I want to leave you with. The absence of disease doesn't guarantee the presence of health. Many of us are more concerned with how we look externally than what's happening internally. Take that into consideration, because you can't see caramelization of your brain unless you're doing an MRI. And not too many people have access to walk into 5 Cities Imaging and get their brain scanned on a regular basis. Last slide. I'm going to read these two to you. Good health is not something we can buy. However, it can be an extremely valuable savings account. We take the time, or at least we should be taking the time, to putting money away for later years. I've got too many patients that sit across my desk who are in those later years who are not able to spend the money that they've saved because they hurt or they're not functioning well. We need to be proactive and look at what's potentially going to be an impediment to us as we get into those periods of time where we actually could be doing things that we'd like to do. And the very last one, those who think they have no time for healthy eating will sooner or later have to find the time for illness. I'll take about 5 minutes of questions and then we're going to wrap things up.
What do you think about fecal transplants?
Thank you. You just led me into the punchline for this whole talk. So if you've read Brainmaker, you know that Dr. Perlmutter talks about fecal transplants. Now that's something that most Westerners go, oh my gosh, did they just say that? And you think, oh, that's not something I ever want to do or be around. But it's not as bad as it sounds. And in fact, there's some pretty amazing things that can happen when you change your intestinal flora. I've talked about how we got there, the 3 factors at birth and the 5 factors as we grow. We know that we start out with about 50% of what we should have, and then through the standard American lifestyle, we're decimating more on a daily basis. So we know that if we're manifesting symptoms, if any of those things applied to you up there, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, any of the autoimmune diseases, any inflammatory situation, you can bet your bottom dollar that you have an imbalance of flora. It's going to be a given. Subsequently, putting back in the ones that should be making these neurotransmitters, handling the detoxification process, converting our nutrients to bioavailable compounds, makes a whole lot of sense. Well, folks say, I've been taking probiotics my whole life and I haven't noticed any difference. Well, when you start to think about this manufacturing plant we have here, you've got about 20 feet of small intestines if you stretch it out, and then all the little microvilli in there that are supposed to be moving food down that pipe, stretch that out and you've got the surface area of 2 tennis courts. So there's a lot of surface there to cover. And if you take that one capsule that has 15 billion live organisms and you drop it down the hatch, and you're hoping to change 100 trillion live organisms that live in the large intestines, you might as well go off the pier, spit into the ocean, and hope to see the water line rise. It's not going to happen. Now, you will get a trickle-down effect. Some of those bacteria will work their way through, and you'll get a percentage through the ileocecal valve into the ascending colon and work its way around. But if you're hoping to make a big change in that region, it's going to have to come through the back door. That's why fecal transplants came into play. So Dr. Perlmutter, in his research, if you haven't read that book, please read it, because he cites specific cases, and 2 that just stood out profoundly to me. One was an MS patient, and one was a patient who had Tourette's, and he had full-body tics. And I'll just encapsulate those briefly. The MS patient showed up and had lost function of his limbs to the point where he needed walking assistance. He started doing probiotic enemas for him in Florida, where his clinic's at. And he found that things really started to improve in a very short period of time, days to weeks. But he plateaued, and he said, you know, definitely I can tell you this has improved because my gait's improved, I have better sensory, I'm functioning better, but I'm really not noticing any more change. And so that's when Dr. Perlmutter said, well, I'm sending you to a colleague of mine in Europe where they do fecal transplants as a matter of course. And he had 10 fecal transplants in a row. By the end of that course of fecal transplants, for all intents and purposes, this man no longer had MS. He was asymptomatic. Case number 2 that he'll share in that book was Tourette's, full body tics. Now remember, I said that those neurotransmitters that are supposed to be made by the bacteria affect how we control motor skills. He sent this patient home. It was a young man about 14 years old with his mom, and the young man was actually excited to do it because he didn't want to be, having tics any longer. He'd like to be out hanging out with his friends. It was really bothersome, and he said, look, if this is going to help, I'll do it. And so his mom did some probiotic enemas with him, and literally after the first one, his tics stopped. Now, that's an extreme case. I've been having my patients do this now for a couple months, and I've seen some profound changes in some, modest changes in others, and no change whatsoever in a handful. Now, the commonality of that, I think, has to be where they started. We all start at different points, and how we're going to change that is going to be through a process like this. I don't know how long it's going to take for any individual. Some of the recommendations have been about 3 times a week for about 6 weeks. And the process would be using an enema bag with a high concentration of probiotic. I've been directing my patients to shoot for about 0.5 trillion. And you can get that in little packages, and you pre-mix that, and you use a small amount of water to start with, and put that into the body via enema, and try and retain it for as long as possible. Done repeatedly, you're starting to colonize that colon. And as that happens, you can bet that your neurochemistry is going to change. Inflammation is going to come down because those lipopolysaccharides, the slimy stuff, it's going to be getting less and less over time. So I'm all in favor of them, to be short in answer after being long.
Do you think there'll be a time when they do here in this country?
Well, in this country, it's already standard, of course, for people who have celiac and Crohn's. If you go, C. difficile. C. difficile, the standard of care, if you go into the hospital and it's proven to be antibiotic resistant, you're going to get, there's about 150 hospitals in the U.S. that are currently doing it, but you're going to get a fecal transplant because it shows to cure it very quickly. In Europe, they've embraced that, and they're using it for all these other disorders. So I think it's just a matter of time until these hospitals that are already doing it embrace that type of information and what the studies are showing and say, let's do it for these other things.
So fecal plant is probiotic.
It's probiotic. What they do is they actually do get a healthy host like the Yanomami Indian, and they just grow those bacteria, purify them, and then they put that into the individual. So it's not as gross as it sounds.
Yeah, I was wondering because you think, what's the host like?
Well, the host in some of these cases has been the spouse of the individual who still has a healthy gut. But the interesting thing to me is that that spouse really doesn't have much healthier gut because statistically we're already at a deficit. But it tells you how impactful just a little bit of good stuff is for somebody who has none.
Yeah, that's true.
What do you think about colostrum for helping to heal the gut?
I think colostrum can be very beneficial when you're looking at some of the immunoglobulins that come from various sources. I used to have a fantastic one here that was purified blood-borne immunoglobulins that they cleaned it to the point where it was basically an omnipotent cell, so it didn't resemble the organism that it came from or the animal that it came from. But the manufacturer decided to sell his rights to a pharmaceutical company. Now we can't get it anymore. It started at it was like $60 a bottle, and as soon as the pharmaceutical company bought it, it went up to $600 a bottle. And it's only by prescription now. And we were using it for almost a decade. I was really bothered by that. Any other questions? Yes.
The difference between, I'm going to say, a soil-based organism or a dairy-type product for a probiotic, which direction?
So when you're looking at probiotics and you're looking at restoring the gut flora, you're looking at specific families. Dr. Perlmutter does list some of the families in there, but in general, let's think about what we're supposed to acquire as we go through the birth canal. As you're going through and that's why C-sections are so bad for these babies, because they're not getting what they're supposed to get inoculated with as they come through the birth canal, because they're brought straight out through the womb. We're supposed to be acquiring some of the lactobacillus species, and we're supposed to be acquiring rich bifidobacter species. So those two colonies have those two species have many subcolonies off of them, and those are the ones that are really the intelligent workers of the intestinal tract. And so I encourage people to look at the back of their bottle and try to avoid the dairy-based ones, because most folks in the U.S. are going to manifest some type of sensitivity to those first big three, gluten, dairy, soy. And so while you're going through this process, until you've proven otherwise, it's just safer to not go there. And so you would go with some of the dairy-free sources of those families. And then you would rotate them. So like I have about 7 different kinds of probiotics here, and I'll have people rotate through those as they're going through this process.
What about kombucha to build your flora?
So using some of the prebiotics or the fermented foods and drinks, that's great. It creates an environment that acts as fodder, good fodder for the good bacteria. And so I encourage people to do that and learn how to do it at home. Be making some of these things. And then you can use some of these unique strains to actually grow it. Any other questions?
What is fermentable? My mind's went blank. Fermentable, the stuff that you eat, fiber, yeah.
So you're going to get your soluble fibers, so things like inulin, Jerusalem artichoke, chicory. You can actually go on to, if you go on and you Google FODMAP, like the 3rd or 4th hit down is going to be Stanford University published a nice PDF on that. And you can look at some of the lower glycemic foods that are rich in soluble fibers. And it'll give you a nice list to choose from. But
Soluble is comparable to?
Insoluble fibers that act more as a bulking agent and scouring agent. Yeah. All right. Thank you for... Oh, yes.
This might be a silly question, but is there any way, what if you, instead of the fecal whatever that thing is, just take a bunch this way? Will it trickle down that way, or do you have to go the other way?
So work through that same analogy that I gave you. You've got 100 trillion here. You're trying to change them, and to get to that, you've got to walk through about 20 feet of small intestines, plus 2 full tennis courts of surface area, and you're hoping to get there with, even if it is copious amounts, you probably will increase the ratio that comes through. I haven't seen it, and the research doesn't support that it's there. However, once it's been changed, it's kind of like any good thing that we do requires work. And once you get a process in place, that snowball is now rolling. That small amount that comes through will keep it moving in the right direction, barring those external 5 factors. So if you're avoiding the antibiotics, the artificial sweeteners, the Roundup ready foods, the stress management, and keeping yourself away from chronic infections, you should be able to make and preserve a healthy flora there.
So you could do it once and be on top of it.
This is the thought, yes. Yeah.
How do you know that when you're at that point?
So symptomatically, most people are going to feel a change. So some of the things that I hear back is, my mental clarity is much improved. My inflammation is coming down. Certainly tick disorders is an obvious one that not only would the subject notice, but the people around them. And so symptomatically, we can start to measure things. But if somebody really wants to know, they can do the stool test before and after and see the change in the Firmicutes to bacterioids.
When you make sauerkraut, you probably do you buy the bacteria, or do you think it's enough just what is in the cabbage?
Knowing what I know about this, I think that it's more beneficial for people to actually bring in the select bacteria that they're trying to promote in their intestines. Of course, you're going to get some from the ambient atmosphere, but if you can promote what you selectively need, you're going to have a better outcome and use your food as medicine. Because what we have on our skin, this is where we get our staph and our strep from. Now, we do need some of those colonies, but you need the bifido and the lacto much more, and you're really not going to get that from just leaving it out.
And do you sell some that would be really good to do some?
What we do carry here is the varieties of bacteria. I don't sell any of the mothers. What I encourage people to do is to find someone that does that specifically. And there's people here in our community that do, and the folks at my front desk can give you names on that. But I encourage people to learn how to go through that process, but I don't have the capacity here to do that. What we do carry here is some of the coconut yogurts that have been fermented, and they have about 4 trillion live organisms per jar in there of the beneficial strains. So that is one way that I get people to kind of make the transition from dairy while still re-inoculating themselves. And some folks have gone to the extent of using some of that yogurt as the base to make their own. So
the ones like the coconut yogurt that you get at California Fresh?
It's the exact same stuff. Yeah.
Oh, so it's not too processed? It's cool?
No, it's not processed at all. They bring it here and it's warm when it comes in. It's growing. We have to vent every jar and then we close it and put it in the fridge.
The one that you get at the California Fresh?
California Fresh carries the exact same one that we carry. We buy it from the same people. They make it right here in Rio Grande.
It's in a jar.
It's in a jar.
Not the plastic, but the plastic.
No, this is in a mason jar.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing stuff if you haven't tried it. Matter of fact, I need to bring a bottle home.
I have a question about the neurofeedback. Is that helpful for people struggling with alcoholism?
Yes. Yeah, addiction disorders work really well with that. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming out.